The telegram arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in Red Cloud, Nebraska, bearing news that would forever alter the course of Davina Turner's existence. Her father was dead, and she had inherited a piece of land she never knew existed in the territorial expanse west of town. She stood on the wooden platform of the train station in May of 1879, clutching the yellow deed in one gloved hand and a battered leather case in the other, watching the steam dissipate into the cloudless prairie sky as the locomotive that had carried her from St. Louis disappeared into the horizon. The wind tasted of dust and possibility, and though grief sat heavy in her chest like an anchor, determination burned brighter. Her father had been a wanderer, a man who could never settle, never stay, never explain where the restlessness came from that drove him from town to town, from opportunity to opportunity. Davina had been raised by her aunt in the civilized confines of Missouri, taught to pour tea and embroider handkerchiefs, and speak in measured tones that betrayed nothing of the fire she kept carefully banked inside. She was 22 years old, possessed of dark auburn hair that refused to stay pinned properly and green eyes that saw too much for most people's comfort. The inheritance had come as a shock. The decision to claim it had been immediate. The land office in Red Cloud occupied a squat building on Main Street, wedged between a dry goods store and a saloon from which piano music drifted at all hours. The clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, had examined her deed with increasing bewilderment before finally locating the corresponding plot on his maps. 80 acres, he told her, about 6 miles northwest of town, near the Republican River Valley. Good grazing land, he said, though his tone suggested he thought it peculiar that a woman alone would have any interest in such information. Davina hired a wagon and driver to take her out to see the property that same afternoon. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a rolling sea of grass already turning golden under the advancing summer heat. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in brilliant bursts of purple and yellow. Hawks circled overhead, riding thermal currents with motionless wings. The driver, an older man named Henry who asked no questions and offered no opinions, pointed out the boundaries as best he could determine them, then left her standing in the middle of what was now hers. The land sloped gently down toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering silver-green in the breeze. To the north, the ground rose in a subtle swell that would provide shelter from winter winds. Davina walked the property until sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, her mind already constructing buildings that did not yet exist, imagining the sound of horses in a corral that was still only grass and possibility. She returned to town as darkness fell, took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Carmichael, and lay awake most of the night making plans. By morning, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Her father had left her land, but he had also left her a small inheritance of actual money, enough to make a start if she was careful and clever. Davina intended to be both. Red Cloud was a growing town, benefiting from the railroad and the steady stream of settlers pushing westward. The ranches surrounding it were expanding, and with expansion came need. Need for horses, for breeding stock, for animals trained to work cattle and pull wagons and carry riders across distances that would break a walking man. Davina had grown up around her uncle's stables in St. Louis. She knew horses the way some people knew scripture. She understood their temperaments, their training, their value. What she needed was a barn to house them and land to pasture them. She had the land. The barn would require something more. The following morning, she visited the town's single bank, a sturdy brick building that smelled of paper and ambition. The banker, a heavy-set man named Thornton, listened to her proposal with visible skepticism creasing his features. A woman, alone, wanting to start a horse trading business. The notion seemed to pain him physically. But Davina had prepared her arguments carefully. She had letters of reference from her uncle, documentation of horse sales she had facilitated, a detailed business plan written in her careful script. More importantly, she had the deed to 80 acres of good land, free and clear. Thornton agreed to a small loan, enough to purchase lumber for a barn and basic supplies. His expression suggested he expected to own her property within the year when she defaulted. Davina thanked him with perfect politeness and left with a bank draft in her pocket and fury, providing additional steel to her spine. She found the carpenter at his workshop behind the general store, a man in his 40s with sawdust in his graying hair and calluses thick as leather on his palms. He quoted her a price for building a barn that would consume most of her loan and smiled when he did it, clearly expecting her to blanch and reconsider. Instead, Davina negotiated, pointing out that she needed a functional structure, not a cathedral, and that surely a man of his skills could work efficiently enough to reduce costs. They haggled for an hour before reaching an impasse. He would not go lower. She could not go higher. That was when Quinn Sullivan walked into the workshop, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe despite the fact that it was tall enough for most men. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block the sunlight streaming through the door and hands that looked capable of breaking horseshoes or healing wounded birds with equal facility. His hair was dark brown, sun-streaked and too long, curling slightly at his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the prairie. He was perhaps 25, dressed in work clothes that had seen better days, and he carried himself with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in the chest. "I heard you discussing a barn project." The carpenter, whose name was Morrison, nodded. "Miss Turner here wants a barn built out on that Turner property northwest of town. I have quoted her a fair price." Quinn's gaze shifted to Davina, and she felt the assessment in it, though there was nothing improper in his expression. He was simply measuring, calculating, the way a man might examine a piece of land before deciding how to work it. "What kind of barn?" "Horse barn," Davina said, lifting her chin slightly. 20 stalls, tack room, hay loft, good ventilation, solid construction. I plan to run a horse trading business." Something flickered in those storm-colored eyes. Interest, perhaps, or respect. "That is an ambitious undertaking." "I am aware of the scope of the project," Davina replied coolly. Quinn turned back to Morrison. "What did you quote her?" Morrison named the figure. Quinn's eyebrows rose fractionally. "That seems high for the work described. Lumber is not cheap," Morrison said defensively. "Neither is my time." "True enough." Quinn was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant, clearly calculating something. Then he looked at Davina again. "I could build it for you, the barn, for half what Morrison quoted." Morrison sputtered an objection, but Davina was already focused entirely on the tall stranger. "You are a carpenter." "I am a man who knows how to build things," Quinn said. "I have built 3 barns in the last 2 years, 2 houses and a church. I can provide references if you want them. Why would you charge half the price?" He smiled then, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Davina's breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "Because I need the work, and I would rather have half of something than all of nothing. Morrison has steady contracts with the bigger ranches. I am newer to the area and trying to establish myself. Also," he added, his expression turning serious again, "I think what you are trying to do is worth supporting. It takes courage to start something new, especially for a woman alone. I respect that. Davina studied him carefully, looking for condescension or mockery and finding neither. When could you start? Tomorrow, if you provide the materials and a place to sleep while I work. It is a fair distance from town to come and go every day. I would estimate 6 weeks to complete the barn, working alone. Less if the weather holds and I can put in long days. 6 weeks. Davina did the mathematics rapidly in her head. With the money saved, she could purchase her first horses sooner, get the business running before summer's end. It was exactly the advantage she needed. I would need to see examples of your work. The church is on the east side of town. The Johansson barn is 3 miles south. I can take you to see them whenever you like. They went that afternoon, Davina riding in a wagon Quinn borrowed from the livery, sitting as far to one side of the bench as propriety demanded, while Quinn handled the reins with easy competence. He spoke little during the journey, pointing out landmarks when relevant, but otherwise content with silence. Davina found it surprisingly comfortable. So many men felt compelled to fill every moment with their own voices. Quinn seemed to understand that silence could be its own form of conversation. The Johansson barn was solidly constructed, with clean lines and careful joinery. The church, though smaller than those Davina had known in St. Louis, had been built with obvious care, its steeple straight and its walls plumb. She examined both buildings thoroughly, checking corners and supports, testing doors and shutters. Quinn watched without comment, answering her questions when she asked them but offering no unsolicited reassurances. "You do good work," Davina said finally, standing in the churchyard as afternoon light slanted golden across the prairie. "I try to build things that last," Quinn replied. "Then we have an agreement. I will purchase the lumber and have it delivered to the property. You will build the barn according to specifications we will establish in writing. Half your fee when you start, half when you finish, contingent on my satisfaction with the work." Quinn extended his hand. His grip when she shook it was firm but careful, aware of his own strength. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Turner." "I cannot afford to do otherwise, Mr. Sullivan." They drew up the contract that evening at the boarding house, Mrs. Carmichael serving as witness, and providing pointed commentary about the propriety of a young, unmarried woman conducting business with a young, unmarried man. Davina ignored her with the practice of someone who had been ignoring such commentary her entire adult life. Quinn seemed equally unbothered, focused on the details of lumber quantities and construction timelines. The materials arrived 4 days later, delivered in 3 wagon loads to the property. Davina had spent those days in town, purchasing basic supplies and arranging for a temporary camp to be established on her land. She bought a sturdy tent, cooking equipment, feed for the horses she did not yet own, and a rifle she barely knew how to use but understood was necessary out here where civilization was still a negotiable concept. Quinn arrived at dawn on the appointed day, riding a rangy bay gelding and leading a pack horse laden with tools. Davina had spent the night in the tent, lying awake listening to coyotes sing to the stars and trying not to think about how alone she was, how far from everything she had known. Morning came as a relief, painting the prairie in shades of pink and gold. "Where do you want it?" Quinn asked, surveying the land with an experienced eye. Davina had already decided. She pointed to the rise of ground she had noticed on her first visit, a spot that would provide natural drainage and shelter while still being close enough to the creek for water access. There. Quinn walked the site, pacing off dimensions, checking the ground for stability. Finally, he nodded. "Good choice. The ground is solid here, We will need to level it somewhat, but that is straightforward work. Davina raised an eyebrow. You are planning to stand around and watch for 6 weeks. I had not planned to be useless, no. Then you can help, if you are willing. Davina rolled up her sleeves. Tell me what to do. The work began with clearing the ground and marking out the barn's footprint with stakes and string. Quinn worked with methodical efficiency, wasting no motion, measuring twice and cutting once. He explained what he was doing as he did it, not lecturing but simply sharing information, treating Davina as a partner rather than a pupil. She fetched and carried, held boards steady while he sawed, learned the names of tools she had never encountered. By the end of the first day, her hands were blistered and her back ached in places she had not known could ache, but the foundation was marked and the first posts were set. Quinn built a small fire as sunset approached, heating beans and coffee in battered pots that had clearly traveled many miles. They ate sitting on logs Quinn positioned near the fire, the prairie stretching dark and vast around them. You did good work today, Quinn said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. I am slower than you would like. You are learning. That is different from being slow. By next week you will be twice as fast. You always work alone? Davina asked. Quinn shrugged. Mostly. I had a partner for a while back in Kansas. He decided ranching suited him better than carpentry and bought some land near Abilene. Since then I have been on my own. I do not mind it. I like the work, and I like seeing something take shape from raw materials. Why did you come to Nebraska? Land is cheaper here than in Kansas. More opportunity for someone without family connections or established reputation. I figured I could build that reputation one barn, one house at a time. He glanced at her over the rim of his cup. What about you? What brings a woman from St. Louis out to the middle of the prairie? Davina hesitated, unused to sharing personal history with strangers. But there was something about Quinn's quiet presence that invited honesty. My father died. I inherited this land. I could have sold it, stayed in Missouri, married some merchant, and spent my days pouring tea, but I wanted something different, something mine. No family objections. My aunt was horrified. My uncle was more understanding, but he thought I should at least wait a year, let him find me a suitable husband who could manage the property. Davina smiled without humor. I did not wait. Their loss, Quinn said simply. You will make this work, I can tell. How? The way you look at the land. The way you asked questions about the barn construction. You are not playing at this. You mean it. The simple confidence in his words warmed something in Davina's chest that had been cold for a very long time. Thank you, she said quietly. They fell into a routine over the following days. Quinn slept in his bedroll under the stars, refusing the tent despite Davina's offers, saying he preferred open sky. They rose with the sun, worked through the heat of the day with a break during the worst of the afternoon, then continued until darkness made it impossible to see. The barn took shape slowly but steadily, posts rising from the ground, beams connecting them in a skeleton that would become walls and roof. Davina learned to hammer nails straight, to measure accurately, to anticipate what tool or material Quinn would need next. Her hands toughened, the blisters becoming calluses. Her muscles adapted to the work. She found herself looking forward to each day, to the satisfaction of visible progress, to the quiet companionship of working alongside someone who did not expect her to be anything other than capable. Quinn proved to be a man of few words but considerable depth. He spoke when he had something worth saying, asked thoughtful questions, listened with genuine attention. Davina learned that he had grown up in Ohio, the youngest of 6 children on a farm that could not support another generation. He had learned carpentry from his grandfather, worked his way west doing odd jobs and construction work, saved his money with the goal of eventually buying land and settling somewhere he could build not just for others but for himself. "You ever get lonely?" Davina asked one evening as they ate dinner by the fire. The barn walls were up now, solid and square, and the roof framework was beginning to take shape. Quinn considered the question seriously, as he seemed to consider everything. "Sometimes. But there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. I have been in crowded places and felt lonely. Out here, working on something I believe in, even by myself, I feel connected. To the land, to the work, to the future I am building toward. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Davina said. "It makes perfect sense." She found herself watching him as he worked, noting the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he lifted heavy beams, the concentration on his face when he fitted joints together, the satisfaction in his rare smiles when something went exactly as planned. It was not attraction, she told herself firmly. It was simply appreciation for skill and dedication. The fact that her heart seemed to beat a little faster when he smiled at her was irrelevant. 3 weeks into the construction, a storm rolled across the prairie with the sudden violence that characterized weather in this part of the country. The sky turned green-black in the span of minutes, wind whipping the grass into frenzied waves. Quinn shouted for Davina to get into the tent while he secured the tools and materials as best he could. She ignored him, helping to weight down lumber and throw canvas over the sawhorses. The rain hit like a physical blow, drenching them instantly. Lightning cracked across the sky close enough that Davina could smell the ozone. Quinn grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the tent, and they stumbled inside just as hail began to hammer down with destructive fury. Inside the tent, breathing hard, dripping water onto the canvas floor, they stared at each other in the dim light. Thunder rolled overhead so loud it seemed to come from inside Davina's own chest. Quinn still held her hand. She could feel the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin despite the cold rain. "You should have gone inside when I told you," Quinn said, but there was no anger in his voice, only something that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. "You needed help," Davina replied. "I did not need you getting struck by lightning. Neither did I need you getting struck by lightning." They were standing very close in the confined space. Davina was acutely aware of every detail. The water dripping from Quinn's hair, the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, the way his eyes looked almost silver in the storm light. The air between them felt charged with more than just the electricity of the weather. Quinn released her hand slowly, deliberately, and stepped back as far as the tent allowed. "I should check on my horse. In this, you will be killed. He gets nervous in storms. He is a horse. He will survive. You, on the other hand, are not immortal despite what your apparent belief in your own invulnerability suggests." A smile tugged at Quinn's mouth. "You are very bossy for someone I am building a barn for. You are very stubborn for someone I am paying to build a barn." The smile widened into something genuine, and Davina felt that flutter in her chest again, stronger this time, undeniable. The storm raged outside, shaking the tent, but inside there was only the two of them and the growing awareness that something was shifting between them, some barrier eroding that had kept things safely professional. Quinn cleared his throat. "I will stay here until it passes, if that is acceptable." It would be foolish to do otherwise. They sat on opposite sides of the tent, carefully not touching, listening to the storm exhaust itself over the course of an hour. By the time the rain diminished to a gentle patter and the thunder faded to distant rumbles, the sun was setting somewhere beyond the clouds, and darkness was settling over the prairie. "I should go check the barn," Quinn said. "Make sure the wind did not do any damage." Davina followed him out into the damp twilight. The barn stood solid and square, water streaming from the partial roof, but the structure intact. Quinn's obvious relief was touching. He walked around it slowly, checking every beam and joint, running his hands over the wood as if reassuring himself of its continued existence. "It held," Davina said softly. "It did. Good materials and good construction, but storms like that can destroy a week's work in minutes. I have seen it happen, but not this time. Not this time." Quinn turned to her, and in the fading light his expression was unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "Thank you for helping me secure things. You probably saved us days of repairs. We are partners in this project," Davina said. "Even if one of us is paying the other." "Is that what we are? Partners?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings beyond the surface words. Davina met his gaze steadily, her heart pounding but her voice calm. "I think we might be becoming friends, if that is acceptable." "It is more than acceptable," Quinn said quietly. "It is probably the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I care to admit." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of work and conversation, and slowly building intimacy that neither of them named but both acknowledged in small gestures. Quinn began bringing Davina coffee in the mornings before she fully woke. Davina started cooking more elaborate meals over the fire, meals that required the vegetables and supplies she made trips into town to purchase. They talked about everything and nothing: books they had read, places they had been, dreams they harbored for futures that seemed increasingly intertwined, though neither spoke that possibility aloud. The barn neared completion. The roof went on, solid and weather-tight. The stalls took shape inside, clean and spacious. The tack room was framed and ready for finishing. Quinn built a wide door that slid on runners he had forged himself from iron stock, smooth and effortless in its operation. On a Tuesday morning in early July, Davina rode into town and returned with a trailer carrying 3 horses. A black mare with white stockings, a paint gelding with intelligent eyes, and a young chestnut stallion whose bloodlines she had verified through careful research. They were the foundation of her breeding program, purchased with the last of her inherited money and chosen with the expertise she had spent years developing. Quinn helped her unload them, his competence with the animals evident in every movement. The horses responded to his calm presence, settling quickly despite the newness of their surroundings. Together, Davina and Quinn led them to the creek to drink, then into the barn where the stalls stood ready, filled with clean straw Davina had purchased and spread herself. "You did it," Quinn said, watching the horses explore their new home. "You built a business from nothing but land and determination." "We did it," Davina corrected. "This barn is as much your creation as mine. I just hammered the nails. You did far more than that, and you know it." Quinn was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the stall door he had not yet hung on its hinges. "There is one more thing that needs doing before the barn is truly finished." "What is that?" "The main door. I have been saving it for last. It needs to be hung and fitted properly." "That is particular work, precision work. How long will it take?" "A day, maybe 2. And then the barn will be complete, and I will have no more reason to be here." Quinn said it without looking at her, his focus apparently on the door in question, but Davina heard the weight in his words. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. 6 weeks ago, Quinn Sullivan had been a stranger. Now the thought of him leaving, of waking up and not seeing him working on the barn or sitting by the fire or looking at her with those storm-colored eyes, felt like a physical ache. "You could stay," she said, the words escaping before she could consider whether they were wise. "There is still work to be done, fencing to build, a house to construct eventually. I could hire you for those projects." "Is that what you want, to hire me?" Quinn turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his expression made her breath catch. "I want you to stay," Davina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not as an employee, as whatever you want to be." Quinn crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just short of touching her, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the faint scar on his chin, the way his pulse beat in his throat. "I want to stay as someone who cares about you. Someone who has spent the last 6 weeks falling in love with your courage and your stubbornness, and the way you look at the sunrise like it is a gift meant only for you. If that is too much, too fast, tell me now and I will finish the door and leave, and you will never have to be uncomfortable around me again." Davina felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unbidden. "It is not too much. It is exactly what I did not know I was hoping you would say." Quinn lifted his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I have nothing to offer you except strong hands and a willingness to work. I do not own land. I do not have money saved beyond what you are paying me. I am nobody from nowhere trying to build something worthwhile. But if you will have me, I will spend every day proving that I am worth the risk." "You already have," Davina said, and rose on her toes to kiss him. It was her first kiss, though she would never admit that aloud, and it was everything she had imagined and nothing like it simultaneously. Quinn's lips were soft but firm, his arms coming around her with careful strength as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. The barn smelled of fresh wood and horse and hay, and somewhere outside a meadowlark was singing, and Davina felt as if every moment of her life had been leading to this one perfect instant of choosing her own future. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Davina Turner. I know it is fast and probably foolish, but it is also true." "Then we will be fast and foolish together," Davina replied. "Because I love you too, Quinn Sullivan." They spent that day finishing the small details of the barn, working side by side as they had for weeks, but now with the freedom to touch casually, to smile at each other without hiding the feeling behind those smiles, to speak of futures that included both of them. The horses watched with what Davina chose to interpret as approval, settling into their stalls with the contentment of animals who knew they had found a good home. That evening, they rode into Red Cloud together. Quinn had asked Davina to marry him as the sun set, without ceremony or ring, simply by asking if she would mind spending the rest of her life with a man who built things and loved her. She had said yes before he finished the question. They found the circuit preacher at the saloon, nursing a whiskey and a losing poker hand, and convinced him to marry them in the church Quinn had built. Mrs. Carmichael served as witness, alternating between scandalized commentary and genuine happiness, insisting on providing a bouquet of wildflowers from her garden. The ceremony was brief, conducted in lamplight with the smell of candle wax and wood polish, but when Quinn kissed his bride and whispered "my wife" against her lips, Davina felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. They returned to the property as husband and wife, to the tent and the barn and the horses and the vast stretch of prairie that was home. Quinn hung the barn door the following morning, fitting it perfectly into the frame, and when he stepped back to admire his work, Davina wrapped her arms around him from behind and rested her cheek against his back. "The barn is finished," she said. "It is. You have your horse business. Now we just need to build a house so we are not living in a tent." "I like the tent." Quinn laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest into hers. "You will like it less when winter comes, trust me." They broke ground on the house the following week, Quinn laying it out with the same care he had given the barn. It would be small but solid, with 2 rooms that could become more as needed. They worked on it between the other demands of the growing business. Davina began advertising her horses, and ranchers started arriving to examine her stock. Word spread quickly that the Turner woman knew her animals, that she was fair in her pricing and honest in her assessments. By August, she had sold the paint gelding for a profit that made her gasp and purchased 2 more horses to replace him. By September, the house had walls and a roof, and they moved out of the tent into a home that smelled of fresh cut pine and possibility. By October, Davina realized she was pregnant, a discovery that filled her with equal parts terror and joy. Quinn took the news with characteristic calm, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to be a family." "We already are a family," Davina corrected. "We are just going to be a bigger one." Winter came early and hard that year, snow blanketing the prairie in white silence. The barn stood strong against the storms, keeping the horses safe and warm. The house proved equally solid, its walls keeping out the brutal cold while the stove Quinn had installed radiated heat. They spent the long dark evenings planning for the spring, for the baby, for the expansion of the business. Davina gave birth in April of 1880, with Mrs. Carmichael attending and Quinn pacing outside the bedroom door like a caged animal until the baby's first cry sent him rushing in, propriety forgotten. The child was a boy, healthy and loud, with a shock of dark hair and his father's storm-colored eyes. They named him Thomas, after Quinn's grandfather. Quinn held his son with the same careful competence he brought to everything, looking down at the tiny face with an expression of such pure wonder that Davina felt tears slip down her cheeks. "He is perfect," Quinn whispered. "He is ours," Davina said. The business continued to grow. By the time Thomas was walking, they had 15 horses on the property and a reputation that extended throughout the region. Quinn built a second, larger barn, and then a bunkhouse for the hired help they could finally afford. Davina proved to be as skilled at training horses as she was at selecting them, and buyers came from as far away as Denver and Kansas City. In the spring of 1882, Davina gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, a quiet baby with her mother's auburn hair and a thoughtful disposition. Thomas, now 2 years old, took his role as older brother with serious dedication, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to lullabies. The property transformed over the years from empty prairie to a thriving ranch. Fences marked the boundaries. Corrals held horses at various stages of training. The barn that Quinn had built with his own hands, the first barn, remained the heart of the operation. Davina had a sign made and hung over the door, "Turner Sullivan Stock, established 1879. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Quinn gave Davina a deed. She unfolded it with trembling hands and read that he had purchased the adjacent 80 acres, doubling their holdings. "How did you afford this?" she asked, stunned. "I have been saving my wages from the contract work I do in the winter. I wanted to give you something that would match what you gave me. What I gave you, a future, a home, a reason to build something that lasts." Quinn pulled her close, his hand gentle on her back. "You took a chance on a stranger with nothing but a toolbox and a promise to build you a barn. You let me stay. You let me love you. This is just land, Davina. You gave me a life." Davina kissed him, pouring 5 years of love and partnership and shared dreams into that kiss. "You gave me the same thing. I was lost when I came here. I had land and inheritance and no idea what to do with either. You helped me build something real." "We built it together," Quinn corrected. The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of lives well lived. Thomas grew tall like his father, showing early aptitude for carpentry and spending hours in Quinn's workshop learning to shape wood. Sarah proved to have her mother's gift with horses, fearless in the saddle and intuitive about what each animal needed. In 1885, Davina gave birth to twins, boys they named James and Henry. The house had been expanded twice by then, growing as the family grew, each addition built by Quinn with the same care he had given that first barn. In 1887, another daughter arrived, Catherine, who came into the world during a spring thunderstorm and seemed to carry that energy with her through every moment of her life. The ranch thrived. The Sullivan family became known throughout Nebraska, not just for the quality of their horses, but for their integrity. Quinn built barns for neighboring ranches, and Davina's expertise was sought for breeding programs across the state. They worked together, partners in every sense, raising their children and their business with equal dedication. On a summer evening in 1895, 16 years after Davina had first stepped off the train in Red Cloud, she stood with Quinn watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas was 20, working as a full partner in the business now. Sarah was 15, already being courted by the respectful son of a neighboring rancher. The twins were 10, wild and inseparable. Catherine was 8, currently collecting tadpoles from the creek with single-minded determination. "You ever regret it?" Quinn asked, his arm around Davina's waist. "Leaving St. Louis, taking the risk." Davina leaned into him, fitting against his side the way she had learned to fit over years of practice. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, this ranch, everything we have built together, it is more than I ever imagined possible." "The barn is still standing," Quinn observed, nodding toward the original structure, weathered now but solid. "You build things to last," Davina said, echoing words he had spoken 16 years earlier. "We built things to last," Quinn corrected, and kissed her temple with the gentle affection of a man who had spent years proving his love in actions rather than words. The night descended slowly, stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. From the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling for the evening. From the creek came Catherine's delighted laughter. From the house came the warm glow of lamplight and the promise of family dinner. Davina thought about the telegram that had changed her life, about the leap of faith that had brought her to Nebraska, about the stranger who had walked into a workshop and offered to build her a barn for half price. She thought about the work they had done together, the life they had created, the love that had grown from partnership into something deep and permanent. "I love you," she said to Quinn, the words as natural as breathing after 16 years of marriage. "I love you," he replied, as he did every day, and would every day for the rest of their lives. They walked back to the house hand in hand, past the barn Quinn had built with his own hands and the stalls Davina had filled before he hung the door. Toward the future, they would continue building together one day at a time. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of summer and possibility, and in that moment everything was exactly as it should be. The years ahead would bring more changes, more growth, more challenges and triumphs. They would see their children marry and have children of their own. They would weather droughts and harsh winters and the inevitable losses that come with time. They would expand the ranch until it sprawled across 300 acres, one of the most successful horse operations in Nebraska. But the core of it, the heart of everything, would always be that first barn and the partnership forged in its construction. When Quinn finally hung the door on that July morning in 1879, fitting it perfectly into place, he had been completing more than just a building. He had been closing the final gap in a life that had been waiting for him, creating a home that would shelter not just horses, but generations of love. Thomas eventually took over the majority of the ranch operations, his carpentry skills put to use maintaining and expanding the facilities. Sarah married the neighboring rancher's son and established her own breeding program on adjacent land, her horses carrying the Turner-Sullivan reputation into a new generation. The twins, James and Henry, proved to have their grandfather's wanderlust, heading west to Colorado where they started a lumber business that supplied materials throughout the region. Catherine, the youngest, became a veterinarian, one of the first women in the state to do so, and returned to the ranch to care for the animals she had grown up loving. Quinn and Davina grew old together the way some couples do, each year adding not distance but deeper intimacy. His hair turned silver but remained thick. Her auburn faded to iron gray, but her eyes stayed bright. They worked side by side until their bodies insisted on rest, and then they sat side by side on the porch they had added to the house in their 10th year of marriage, watching the ranch continue without their direct involvement, but still bearing the mark of their vision. In the summer of 1915, on an afternoon when the heat shimmered across the prairie and thunderheads built in the western sky, Quinn and Davina walked out to the original barn. It was still in use, though newer, larger structures had been added over the decades. Quinn ran his hand along the doorframe, checking the wood with the instinct of a builder who could never quite stop assessing his work. "Still solid," he said with satisfaction. "You told me you built things to last," Davina reminded him. "We did. We built a life that lasted." They stood in the barn doorway, looking out over the property they had developed from raw prairie into a thriving enterprise. The corrals were full of horses, descendants of that first black mare and chestnut stallion. The house had grown into a sprawling homestead. The land stretched green and productive, marked with fences and outbuildings and all the evidence of years of purposeful labor. "Thank you," Davina said softly. Quinn turned to her, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "For what?" "For walking into that workshop. For offering to build the barn. For staying. Thank you for letting me stay, for seeing something in a broke carpenter that was worth taking a chance on." "I saw everything I needed," Davina said. "I saw a man who could build a future. I was right." Quinn kissed her, and despite the decades that had passed since their first kiss in this very barn, the feeling was the same. Coming home, choosing love, building something that would outlast them both. They had built the barn together, filled it with horses that became a business, hung the door on a future neither could have imagined when they started. And in the process, they had built a love story that would be told by their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a story of partnership and courage, and the kind of devotion that only grows stronger with time. As they walked back to the house that evening, Quinn's hand in Davina's, the barn stood solid behind them, a monument not just to skilled construction, but to the moment two strangers decided to build something together, and discovered in the process that they were building not just a structure but a life, not just a business but a legacy, not just a partnership but a love that would endure as long as the wood and nails and mortared dreams that held up the walls. The sun set over the prairie, painting everything in shades of gold, and the barn door stood open in welcome, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, just as it had stood for 36 years and would stand for many more to come. Quinn had built it with his own hands. Davina had filled every stall with horses that became their fortune. And together, before the cowboy hung that door, they had created something far more valuable than any building or business could ever be. A love that transformed two solitary people into an unbreakable whole, a partnership that turned empty land into a home, a legacy that would ripple through generations yet unborn. In the gathering dusk, Catherine emerged from the veterinary clinic they had built for her near the main house, waving to her parents. Thomas rode in from the north pasture, still putting in long days despite having children of his own who were old enough to help. Sarah's wagon appeared on the road from her ranch, bringing grandchildren for their weekly dinner. The twins had returned from Colorado for the summer, their own children in tow, filling the homestead with noise and laughter and life. Quinn and Davina stood on the porch and watched their family converge on the home they had built, and the satisfaction that filled them both was deeper than words could express. This was what they had created when Quinn offered to build a barn for half price, and Davina accepted despite her better judgment. This sprawling, chaotic, beautiful family. This ranch that employed 20 people and supplied horses throughout the West. This legacy that would continue long after they were gone. No regrets? Quinn asked one more time, though he already knew the answer. Only that I did not find you sooner, Davina replied. We found each other exactly when we were meant to, Quinn said. Not a moment before, not a moment after. Exactly when we were both ready to build something real. Dinner that evening was a raucous affair. 3 generations gathered around the massive table Quinn had built when the family outgrew the original one. The grandchildren chattered about horses and school and adventures. The adult children discussed business and neighbors and plans for expansion. Quinn and Davina sat at opposite ends of the table, presiding over the chaos with the contentment of people who knew exactly how blessed they were. After the meal, after the dishes were cleared and the children were put to bed and the adults had drifted into smaller conversations, Quinn found Davina on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song. Quinn sat in the rocking chair next to his wife, reaching over to take her hand. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds, feeling the prairie wind on their faces. 36 years of marriage had taught them that silence could be as meaningful as words, that presence was sometimes more important than speech. I would do it all again, Quinn said eventually. Every single day, exactly the same way, even the parts where I was difficult. Davina asked, amusement coloring her voice. Especially those parts. You were never difficult. You were strong and certain and unwilling to compromise your vision. I loved that about you then. I love it about you now. Davina squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that age had diminished but not eliminated. We made a good team. We made a great team. We still do. They rocked gently in their chairs. 2 people who had built an empire from nothing but determination and mutual respect, and love that had started as partnership, and grown into something that defined both their lives. The barn Quinn had built stood dark against the starlit sky, a silhouette that represented everything they had achieved together. In the years that followed, they would slow down further, handing over more responsibilities to their children, spending their days in gentle pursuits rather than hard labor. But they never stopped being partners. They never stopped consulting each other on decisions, never stopped working together on the smaller projects that still needed attention. They never stopped loving each other with the fierce devotion that had carried them through decades of building and growing and living a life that defied every expectation placed on them. Quinn Sullivan lived to the age of 78, passing peacefully in his sleep in the house he had built, surrounded by the family he and Davina had created. His final words, spoken to his wife as she held his hand, were simple and true. We built something beautiful. Davina Turner Sullivan lived another 5 years, continuing to work with the horses she loved, spending time with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward the legacy of hard work and integrity she and Quinn had established. She died on a spring morning in 1922, sitting on the porch of the house with a cup of coffee and a view of the barn, slipping away as gently as falling asleep. They were buried side by side on a rise overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the words Quinn had chosen long ago. We built things to last. The barn continued to stand, maintained by each successive generation of the Sullivan family. The ranch continued to thrive, adapting to changing times but never losing sight of the principles Davina and Quinn had established. The story of the woman who came to Nebraska with nothing but inherited land and determination, and the man who built her a barn and stayed to build a life, became family legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But it was not myth. It was real. As real as the barn that still stood more than a century later, as real as the land that still bore the Sullivan name, as real as the love that had started with a simple offer to help and grown into something that transcended time and circumstance, and every limitation that might have prevented it. Quinn had built the barn with his own hands, each nail driven with care, each beam fitted with precision, creating something that would shelter and protect. Davina had filled every stall with horses before the cowboy hung the door, establishing the business that would sustain them, pursuing her vision with unwavering focus. And together, they had built something even more enduring than wood and nails. A partnership, a family, a love that proved that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning but from the courage to take a chance on a stranger who offers help, and the wisdom to recognize when that stranger is actually your future standing right in front of you, waiting for you to say yes. The prairie wind continued to blow across the land, carrying the scent of grass and horses and possibility, just as it had on that first day when Davina stepped off the train and began the journey that would lead her to Quinn. The barn stood solid and true, a monument to skilled hands and patient work. The ranch stretched productive and prosperous, evidence of vision made manifest. And somewhere in the timeless space where love lives after those who created it have moved on, Quinn and Davina continued their partnership, bound together by the simple truth that they had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it, and had the courage to build a life on that foundation. The door Quinn hung on that July day in 1879 still swung smooth on its hinges more than a century later, maintained by descendants who understood that some things are worth preserving, that some acts of creation carry meaning beyond their immediate utility. Every time that door opened to admit horses seeking shelter or closed to keep them safe, it was a reminder of the beginning, of the first structure that became an empire, of the partnership that transformed two lives into a legacy. And that legacy lived on not just in property and business and buildings, but in the way each generation of Sullivans approached their work with integrity, treated their partners with respect, and understood that the most valuable things in life are built slowly, carefully, with patience and devotion, and an unwavering commitment to creating something that will last. Quinn had been right all those years ago when he told Davina he liked to build things that lasted. They had built something together that outlasted both of them, that continued to grow and evolve and influence lives decades after they were gone. They had built it with love and labor, with vision and determination, with the simple radical act of choosing each other, and choosing to stay chosen through every challenge and change that life brought their way. The sun rose over the Nebraska prairie each morning, painting the land in shades of gold and promise, illuminating the barn and the house and all the structures that had grown up around them over the course of a century. The Sullivan Ranch woke to another day of work and purpose, carrying forward the legacy of the woman who dared to claim her inheritance, and the man who helped her build it into something neither could have achieved alone. And in the quiet moments, when the wind sang through the barn rafters and the horses moved peacefully in their stalls, and the weight of history sat light on the shoulders of those who worked the land, it was possible to feel the presence of Quinn and Davina still, their love woven into the very fabric of the place they had created, eternal as the prairie itself, enduring as the barn that started it all. He built the barn with his own hands. She filled every stall before the cowboy hung the door. And together, they built a love that would never end, a legacy that would never fade, a story that would be told as long as the barn stood, and the land remembered the two people who had the courage to look at empty prairie and see not what was but what could be, and then spent their lives making that vision real.